And so on the one hand, it's this story of the people of God kind of coming into this great blessing, right? This great reversal of fortunes where they've been in exile and now they're coming back into their land. Like, how does that even happen, right? Unheard of. But at the same time, they're this people who are sort of dealing with the fallout of this great national trauma that they've all experienced, right? And one of the things that we've talked about along the way for the last few weeks is like, there's like these great ups and downs in Ezra and Nehemiah. Like, there's these great heights of just these incredible things that are happening, but then there's these like oddly strange low things that happen in this book as well, where it just kind of makes you scratch your head like, what in the world? Like, how does this happen? Right? And so you've got this sort of dichotomy, and kind of in the middle of that is this question of, is God still in this? And so, as we go into sort of the Nehemiah part of this book, we still kind of see that pattern of these like highs, but these sort of weird lows, and trying to assess and try to figure out, is God really in this thing? Miraculous or supernatural? Like, if you really go back and look at it, I mean, there's a lot of places where Nehemiah, he ascribes, hey, it's because God was with us this happened. It's because God did this. But if you really read it and look at what happens throughout this book, there's nothing actually that happens that's very overtly miraculous or supernatural. And it's to the point where, you have Nehemiah who's kind of recounting these things and he's attributing all these things to God. But I could definitely see how a skeptic could come to these same events and totally interpret them as, well, is it really a miracle? Like, I don't know, it just kind of seems like stuff happened, right? Like a good fortune or just happenstance, right? Stuff happens. And in this case, good stuff happens and bad stuff happens. And in this case, good stuff happened. Let's see what happens tomorrow. But is this really like God was in this, doing this? I don't know, right? Like, if you really kind of look at what happens, you could easily interpret it in two different ways, right? As, wow, look at all the crazy stuff God did, or, I don't know, maybe we were just lucky. Maybe the Jewish people were just in a fortunate circumstance. And so there's kind of this tension of that, where, yeah, you could interpret it in two different ways. So in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, and we will read some of the verses. In chapter 1 of Nehemiah, Nehemiah, he hears through one of his relatives and some men from Judah about the condition of Jerusalem, and in particular, that the walls of Jerusalem are just lying in ruins. They're lying in ashes. They burned to a crisp, right? And they're still lying desolate. And so, when he hears this, he immediately just bursts out into tears, and it's just like, it says he was in tears and in mourning for several days. So in chapter 2, the Persian king, he sees Nehemiah, he sees that something's wrong with him, he's all depressed, and he asks him, hey, what's going on, Nehemiah? Nehemiah, he works up the courage to tell him about, the state of his homeland, and makes this request before the king. Can you allow me to go back, and would you give me like letters to, to provision supplies for us to go build my homeland, right? And the king grants his request. Right? The king says, yeah, sure, I'll grant this request, which is a huge deal. And according to Nehemiah in verse 8, we're not going to look at it, but in chapter 2, verse 8, Nehemiah ascribes this to, quote, the good hand of my God was on me. That's why the king granted this favor, right? He's kind of like, yes, God did it. He did it. I prayed and God answered my prayer. It's a miracle. But again, I think if we stop here, we could ask the question again, is God in this, right? Because again, Nehemiah, he sees this and he ascribes God's work. It's a miracle. But I could definitely see how the skeptic could kind of be like, okay, yeah, I mean, it's no doubt extraordinarily good fortune, right? But is it miraculous? I mean, maybe it's just the fact that, hey, Nehemiah happens to be in a position close to a very powerful person. He has the ear of the king. Obviously, the king seems to care about him. Maybe the king's just nice. Maybe, by the beginning of chapter 4, it's really gotten the attention of some of the surrounding people, some of kind of the opponents of Israel of old, right? Some of the surrounding peoples and nations. And so they're really kind of taking notice, and they're not too happy about it. They're not too happy that Israel is rebuilding their city walls and doing it very quickly. In chapter 4, verse 2, in fact, one of them is quoted as saying, will they finish this in a day? Which I think is his way of saying, like, how the heck are they doing this so fast, right? And are we going to let this stand, right? So they're getting kind of unhappy and maybe uncomfortable that the Jewish nation seems to be rebuilding and gathering strength. And so, basically what these enemies do is they begin to mobilize against the Jewish people and threaten them, try to get them to stop rebuilding under the threat of violence. And actually what we see in chapter 4 is with the threat of violence, suddenly the people's will to rebuild kind of starts to waver, right? Some of their courage, some of their will to work starts to begin to fade. So this is Nehemiah speaking to the people as their kind of, their courage is wavering in front of the opposition that they're facing. So let's read together. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. Like, I hear it in kind of like the Scottish, I don't know if you hear it that way, I hear it in the Scottish accent. They can never take our freedom, right? And so he gives them this speech and they respond. Talk about today. And actually, we get to chapter 5, and this is one of those places where you have one of those surprising lows, actually kind of shocking when you read what happens. Basically, the people the people come and raise a complaint to Nehemiah and the other Jewish leaders. And the reason why they complain is because, even though they're back in the land, times are still tough, right? A lot of people are struggling. People struggling for food, to provide for their families. And so the complaint that they bring before Nehemiah is that many of them are being forced to borrow money, borrow grain, food, to sustain their families. And basically they're borrowing from the wealthy people within Israel. And basically, these wealthy people are loaning to them, but they're exacting interest from them, and they're also asking them to put their land down as collateral for these loans. And so inevitably, when these people are unable to pay back the loans, basically they're taking that land, which they put down as collateral, and giving it away, or selling it, or whatever. And so basically, because they're taking these loans because that's the only thing that they can do to survive, and they're defaulting on these loans, and these rich, Jewish people are basically taking away their land, their only means of income and sustenance. A lot of these people are having to resort to selling their own children into slavery just to make it, right? Very low, right? It's almost shockingly low. Like, what? How does this happen in this story, right? So in spite of the opposition, the wall does eventually get completed in chapter 6. Spoiler alert, we're not talking about chapter 6. But, in chapter 6, Nehemiah actually says, even their enemies knew it was with the help of God that they were able to do this. So again, Nehemiah ascribing what has happened and their success to God. Like, this is a miracle. God did this. God provided. He allowed us to accomplish this thing, right? But again, I think we can return to the question that we've been asking. Is God really in this? Is God in this? Is this really a miracle as Nehemiah would have us believe? I mean, this wasn't exactly Moses parting the Red Seas, right? It wasn't quite, like, that's pretty obvious. Everybody can acknowledge, well, this is a work of God. Was it God who helped the people overcome the opposition? Or was it 24/7 guard shifts, and everyone working with one hand while on the other hand holding a sword or a spear? And could God really have been in it when all the while the rich people were greedily allowing their own countrymen to sell their children into slavery to survive while they got richer off their hardships and had to be confronted and made to swear to stop doing such things? Like, could God really have been the one in this and doing this when all that stuff was happening in the community at the same time? And so, I don't know, I find this incredibly relatable. I don't know about you guys. I find this incredibly relatable because I feel like it matches my own experience of what God is like and how God works, how I've seen God work in my life. You know, if I'm being totally honest, I can't point to too many like parting the Red Sea type moments. Like there are some moments where I feel like, man, this is hard to say it wasn't God, but there aren't a lot of parting the Red Sea type moments that I can really point to. But many of the moments where I felt like I saw Jesus, or I knew Jesus was doing something, or I knew that Jesus had shown up in my life, that Jesus had like intervened in some way, or rescued in some way, provided in some way. A lot of those moments in my life, I have to recognize that I could see how another person could easily explain those things away as maybe just a coincidence, good fortune, happenstance. It just happened, right? It's just something that happened. And you know, maybe, I guess what I'm taking from this is maybe the providence of God is just like that, right? That maybe the providence of God is just like that. That you could see it and you could not see it all at the same time. And maybe you've experienced that too. You know, and maybe the only difference between those who see it and those who don't is faith, right? That depending on your perspective, whether you're coming with a perspective of faith or trust or belief, can make the difference between whether you see miracles or you see happenstance and you see coincidences and things that can just kind of be explained away. I mean, even Jesus would often say, "He who has eyes to see and ears to hear," which to me sounds a whole lot like you might see it, but you might also see nothing, right? It kind of just depends on your perspective, right? It's kind of perplexing how that can be, how it can be that he's here yet he's not here. We see him, but we don't see him, all at the same time. But at the same time, I don't know about you guys, but I somewhat find this comforting. I find this a little bit comforting just to know that it isn't just me who feels like this sometimes, right? That experiencing God it's not just my experience where I feel like, a lot of the stuff that I feel like God has done in my life, I feel like could easily also be explained by just, good fortune and coincidence. That maybe this is sort of the part of the nature of faith and discipleship when, you are a broken people living in a broken place, when you're living in that sort of in-between space between, the transition from night to day. And even though the sun has dawned, the air still has, kind of a chill from night in it. There's still a layer of clouds that's trying to hide the sun's light. But undeniably, a new day has come, and soon all traces of the night will disappear.